Napoleon left the conduct of the battle in this sector to Ney, for reasons that are not entirely clear. Some say he was too ill to assume direction himself, others that he was now preoccupied with the Prussian threat. Certainly the first sighting of Bülow's Prussians came around 1:30 p.m. when a column was spied some miles off near Planchenoit, moving towards the French right. The Emperor was forced to detach Lobau's VI Corps and 2 brigades. Ney and D'Erlon advanced with 8,000 men, 1 brigade veering off at the last moment to attack La Haye-Sainte. The battle for La Haye-Sainte was another murderous affair and soon turned into a second Hougoumont. Meanwhile, in the center, 2 of D'Erlon's 4 divisions advanced in a compact formation, the result, it seems, of yet more botched orders, and presented unmissable targets to the British gunners. Had Ney supported the infantry with cavalry, the Allies would have been forced to form square, which could then have been decimated with case shot from the horse artillery. Raked by devastating volleys, D'Erlon's men still came on and were soon engaged in murderous combat with Picton's 5th Division, the best infantry on the Allied side. Picton was killed by a musket ball, but his men held firm and gradually pushed the French back. Although the flanking divisions from D'Erlon's corps had fared better than the central 2, largely because they were faced by Bylance's already weakened brigade, they bore the brunt of the British counterattack when General Lord Uxbridge ordered a cavalry charge. Lord Anglesey's household cavalry and Somerset's horse guards cut through the French left flank like a knife through butter, while Ponsonby's Union Brigade, including the 2nd North British Dragoons, charged through the centre. In the ecstasy of the moment, the Scots Greys and other cavalry in the centre continued their charge towards the French guns. Taking charge of the battle for a while, Napoleon waited then time to countercharge by his lancers to perfection. Jacquinot's lancers took the Greys in the flank from right and left, causing severe casualties. Of 2,500 horsemen who charged, more than 1,000 were killed or wounded. However, Wellington's main aim of buying time by repulsing D'Erlon's I Corps had been achieved, and in the meantime the first French attack on La Haye-Sainte had also failed. At 3 p.m. came another of the great blunders of the day. Preoccupied with the Prussians, Napoleon ordered fresh attacks on Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, hoping to roll up Wellington's advance posts and move in for the kill before Blucher's men could intervene. At this moment, Ney inexplicably ordered the entire French cavalry to charge the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean without infantry backup. It has been conjectured that he mistook a redeployment in Wellington's lines for a general retreat, or that he misread the withdrawal of some ambulance wagons towards Brussels as a sign that the Allies were wavering. Ney thus managed in one and the same battle to send in infantry unaided by cavalry, and cavalry unaided by infantry. At all events, the result of this folly was predictable. The unsupported horsemen were cut to pieces by British squares using case shot. Ney tried again. He called up Kellerman's division of cuirassiers and the heavy squadrons of the Guard. Once again the French were funneled into a narrow R2-meter wide front between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, but still the valiant cavalrymen came on. The British line at last showed signs of buckling, and if the French had thrown in infantry at this point, they would have won the day. As it was, Wellington had to use up most of his infantry and cavalry reserves in order to achieve the final repulse of the French. The battered survivors of Ney's hair-brained assault were extricated from the firestorm of the British squares only with great difficulty by General Kellerman. Around 4 p.m. came 2 somber items of news, which made Napoleon revise his earlier estimate of the odds down to 6-40 in favor. Grouchy sent word that he was heavily involved in fighting with the Prussians around Wavre, and would therefore be taking no part in the battle at Waterloo, and Bülow's relieving corps reached the wood 2 miles from the French right flank. Here they were met by Lobau's corps. The French defense against a force 3 times numerically superior was so skillful that they delayed the Prussians in and around the village of Placenoit for 2 hours. When the Prussians finally drove them out, Napoleon sent in the Young Guard to force them back again. Although Bülow played no part in the main battle, he forced the Emperor to divert I-40 men away from Wellington at a critical time. By this time Napoleon was making the capture of La Haye-Sainte a priority. The French attacked with 3 battalions of infantry and some engineers. The heavy doors of the farm were battered in, the defenders ran out of ammunition, and at last La Haye-Sainte fell, just after 6 p.m. Less than 50 of the original 900 defenders of the King's German Legion survived. Ney then wheeled up big guns to almost point-blank range of Wellington's centre, and pounded away. This time he sensed a definite wavering and sent to the Emperor for the Guard to make the final breakthrough. This was yet another moment when Napoleon by swift action could have won the day. But he was still obsessed by the Prussians and reacted to Ney's request with bluster. Troops, where am I supposed to get them from? Do you want me to manufacture some? But some military historians think the true reason Napoleon did not indulge Ney was that the Marshal had lost credibility and had cried wolf once too often. It took until 6:45 p.m. for the Guard to stabilize the front facing Bülow. By then Wellington had used the slight lull in fighting to stiffen the center by throwing in his last reserves of foot and horse. As Napoleon's confidence rose, the Dukes dipped, "God bring me knight or bring me Blucher," Wellington was heard to remark. Then at around 7 p.m. Napoleon decided to send in the middle guard to finish the business. French spirits rose as Napoleon led forward 11 battalions of his crack troops and handed them over to Ney at the smoking ruins of La Haye Sainte, and morale soared even higher as Ney spurred on the immortals of the Grand Army, resplendent in their columns 70 to 80 men wide. Ney was not a bit cast down when, for the 5th time that day, he had a horse shot from under him. He simply drew his sword and joined the front ranks of the guard. Soon the guard came under fire from British guns at Hougoumont, but initially they made good progress, overran the Brunswick Brigade on the forward slope of Mont Saint-Jean and captured 2 artillery batteries. Then they attacked and drove back the left-hand square of Halkett's brigade. Unexpectedly, the Belgians counterattacked, forcing back 1 battalion of the guard with a barrage from horse artillery on the crest of the ridge, firing grape shot, and following with a bayonet charge. By this time the French grenadiers were engaged in furious combat with the 69th Foot, and the 33rd Foot, Wellington's old regiment from India. Nonetheless, 2 battalions of the chasseurs were on the point of gaining the crest when Wellington played his only remaining card. He ordered the 1st Foot grenadiers, who had been lying hidden on the reverse slopes, to rise up and confront the enemy. A scorching volley from the 1st Foot stopped the guard dead in their tracks. As they hesitated, losing men all the time, they made the fatal mistake of deploying under fire. Taken in the flank by more British infantry, the guard fell into confusion. The 1st Foot advanced with bayonets drawn and drove Napoleon's crack troops down the slope towards Hougoumont, where they collided with the still advancing rear columns of the Guard, the 4th Chasseurs and the remainder of the 4th Grenadiers. The 1st Foot retreated to the foot of the ridge and turned to face the hastily reassembled Guard. On came the French again, and this time they seemed likely to overwhelm the opposition. Suddenly a fresh British force, the SC&D Foot under Sir John Colborne, appeared over the crest of the ridge on the left flank of the Guard and began to pour volleys into the massed columns of the 4th Chasseurs. When they followed with a bayonet charge, the Chasseurs wavered, then slowly gave ground. Up went the cry no member of the Grand Army ever thought to hear: "La Garde recule! The Guard is retreating." Almost by a magical pre-established harmony at this very moment the Prussians finally broke through on the French left. 33,000 fresh troops came flooding onto the field. Napoleon had been bolstering the spirits of his men by the blatant lie that the men they could see on their right were Grouchy's 33,000, not the Prussians. When they realized the awful truth, the men became demoralized and panic-stricken. "Treason," came the cry. "We are betrayed." Some still thought that the Prussians who opened fire on them were Grouchy's men, now suborned by the Bourbons. But whether they thought of them as Prussians or renegade Frenchmen, the effect was the same. First a catastrophic plummeting of spirits, then panic, and finally rout. It was not more than 10 minutes after the arrival of the Prussians that Wellington rode to the crest of the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, and waved his hat 3 times in a prearranged signal to order a general advance. The entire Allied army descended from the ridge like a torrent. Napoleon ordered his veterans of the Old Guard to form square and try to rally the fleeing troops, but they were swept aside in the melee. 3 battalions of the Old Guard then took up station at La Belle Alliance, covering the flight of their emperor and their comrades. Their commander, General Cambron, was called on to surrender but refused, according to the legend, with one word: murd. The Allies brought up big guns and mowed down the valiant Guard where they stood. There was now no possibility of rallying the army. Scenes of the utmost chaos were witnessed as the defeated Grand Army streamed away southwards. Lobau's men fell back in good order from their position on the right, avoiding encirclement by the Prussians. Sauve-qui-pute was the watchword as Prussian cavalry pursued the vanquished throughout the night. At 9 p.m. Wellington met Blücher at La Belle Alliance, and both hailed each other as the victor. "Quelle affaire," Blücher remarked. Wellington's comment as he surveyed the heaps of dead is well known, that next to a battle lost the saddest thing he knew was a battle won. The day after the battle he wrote, "It was the most desperate business I was ever in. I never took so much trouble about any battle, and never was so near being beat. Our loss is immense, particularly the best of all instruments, the British infantry. I never saw the infantry behave so well. The French lost 25,000 in dead and wounded at Waterloo plus some 8,000 prisoners. Wellington's casualties were IS 0 and the Prussians 7,000. Altogether during the 3 days of I-8 June the Allies had lost SS 0 against 60,000 of the French." Wellington went on to fame and immortality on the strength of this victory, but he could not have won without Prussian intervention, which was only the most signal of Napoleon's blunders throughout the day. A fair non-Anglo-centric judgment would be that Napoleon lost the battle through his own multiple errors rather than that Wellington won it by singular military genius. It is doubtful that the emperor's illness made any real difference, though his arch-defenders claim that this resulted from a poisoning attempt or that his plans had been betrayed to the British by a spy. The plain truth seems to be that Napoleon performed far below his best form, and that something happened to his martial talents in general during the lackluster 4-day Belgian campaign. Napoleon rode away from the battle towards Charleroi, tears coursing down his cheeks, his face described as a mask of pain and exhaustion. Next day he made a partial recovery as he reassessed the situation. On paper his fortunes after Waterloo were by no means so desperate as they are usually presented. Given that Grouchy had disengaged at Wavre with most of his corps intact, the emperor still had 7,000 men available for the defense of Paris to face roughly the same number under Blücher and Wellington. By July he would have another RZ0 men plus 36,000 National Guardsmen, 30,000 sharpshooters, 6,000 gunners and 600 artillery pieces for the defense of Paris. The Allies could not cross the Somme with much more than 90,000 men, while the Austrians and Russians could not be on the Marne before Arrest July, by which time the emperor calculated he could have 80,000 sharpshooters in position, doling out unacceptable casualties on the advancing enemy columns. As he remarked to Joseph, what was needed now was the spirit of Rome after the disaster of Cannae, not the defeatist spirit of the Carthaginians after the Battle of Zama. What was missing was his own energy and commitment. France could be mobilized to fight for the emperor only if he showed the face of a fighter who would never give up. But Napoleon was depressed, ill, suffering from lack of sleep and, above all, indecisive. When he conferred with his generals, there were divided counsels. Devout urged him to return to Paris, prorogue the Senate and the Chamber, and set himself up as a dictator. Others urged him to ignore constitutional niceties altogether, ignore Paris and remain in the field with his army. But as he did so often during the 100 Days, Napoleon chose a third option, less satisfactory than either. He decided to return to Paris and work within the context of constitutional niceties. This was such a gross error that it is hard not to see him at this juncture unconsciously willing his own destruction. Later he himself admitted his decision was an act of consummate folly and could scarcely give a rational account of it. The situation in Paris was parlous, as everybody knew. Indeed, it had been emphasized again and again by those of his supporters who urged him to remain in the field. During the 100 Days, as part of his new liberal image, Napoleon had officially shared power with his ministers and the two chambers. To prevent ministers and assembly from making common cause, he ordered a total separation of powers, forbidding his ministers to have any contact with the legislature. But in his absence Fouché campaigned tirelessly against him. Once news of Waterloo came in, Fouché bent all his energies to fomenting panic in Paris, stressing that the Grand Army had been totally destroyed and that Bonaparte was returning to make himself a dictator. Fouché had long been plotting for the contingency of the emperor's military defeat, when he thought the hour of Fouché would come at last. The question is why Napoleon, as usual, did nothing about him. He threatened to hang him after his first victory in Belgium and later remarked ruefully, "If I had just hanged two men, Talleyrand and Fouché, I would still be on the throne today." There is a continuing mystery about his weakness when faced with the treachery of the trio of Bernadotte, Talleyrand and Fouché, which no student of Napoleon has ever satisfactorily explained. Given all this, it was absurd for Napoleon to return to Paris and play by the constitutional rule book. He should have seized control and dissolved the legislature as Devout urged, relying on the loyalty of the garrison and people of France. When he reached Paris at dawn on the 21st of June, he still had powerful cards up his sleeve. He had plenty of support, for his lucid way with statistics persuaded wavering ministers to give him their backing, while even Carnot joined Lucien, Lebedoyer and Devout in pleading for the immediate imposition of martial law and the removal of the fractious legislature to Tours. They pointed out that the people were on his side, a fact evident when the crowd acclaimed him in front of the Élysée. Once again Napoleon dithered, but if he was lacking in energy, the diabolical Fouché was not. On 2 June, at his instigation, the two chambers declared themselves in permanent session, indissoluble except by their own will, and called in the National Guard for protection. Repeatedly urged to use force against the Chamber of Deputies, Napoleon refused, on grounds of refusal to shed blood and unwillingness to head a 1793-style revolution. Foolishly he declared he would never become an emperor of the rabble and claimed that to harness the people to his cause would simply plunge France into civil war even as the Allies began their invasion. His continuing loyalty to the interests and principles of the bourgeoisie who had betrayed him is more than just strange, and suggests a kind of morbid, even pathological, political conservatism that transcended his own self-interest. He was also confused, indecisive, unrealistic and out of touch, and irritated his supporters by claiming that such and such a thing was impossible when it was already an accomplished fact. Instinctively, the hyenas seemed to sense that the lion was wounded, for when Lucien went to the chamber to try to talk the deputies round, he got nowhere. Lafayette, in particular, played a leading role in stiffening the resolve of his colleagues against a possible second Brumaire, and outpointed Lucien in the debate, winning an ovation for his charge that since 1805 Napoleon had compassed the deaths of 3 million Frenchmen. The debate ended with an explicit demand for the emperor's abdication and the appointment of a provisional government under Fouché. With tension running high, it was largely a question of whose nerve would crack first. In private, Napoleon raged to Benjamin Constant that the demand for his abdication, which would have as one of its consequences the disbandment of the Grand Army while the enemy were at the gates of Paris, was peculiarly absurd and gutless. If the Assembly did not want him, they should have made this plain when he was marching from Antibes to Paris, or before he set out on the Waterloo campaign. To do so now was tantamount to betraying France to her enemies. But in public he bowed his head. On the 22nd of June he formally abdicated in favor of his son the King of Rome. Disgusted and disillusioned, Devout began to think of his own future, and allowed himself to become a pawn in Fouche's devious game. Fouche sent Devout to the Emperor on the 24th of June, urging him to leave Paris at once to avoid bloodshed. Fouche's real fear was that his own plans might still be scuppered by a spontaneous popular uprising in favor of the Emperor, or by a pro-Bonaparte military coup by one of the marshals. It was known that the 70,000 men who had rendezvoused with Grouchy at Laon were angry at news of the abdication. The passive and flaccid Napoleon fell in meekly with his plans and departed for Malmaison on the 25th of June, but not before he had expressed anger that Devout was doing Fouche's dirty work for him. The transparent story that the Emperor was leaving the capital because of assassination fears fooled nobody. At Malmaison, Napoleon was the guest of his stepdaughter Hortense de Beauharnais, who had inherited on Josephine's death. There was some consolation in being with his extended family. Marie Waleska, who had been with him throughout the 100 days except on the 4-day Belgian campaign, was there along with an early and a late Bonaparte mistress, respectively Madame Duchâtel and Madame Pellepre. Also there were his two natural sons, Alexander Walewski and Comte Leon. Once at Malmaison, a depressed emperor, convinced that his star had deserted him and that his public life was over, considered his options. Where should he go and with what aim? Surrender to the Allies was not feasible, given that they had outlawed him. The Prussians reiterated that they would execute him if they caught him, and even though the Austrians and Russians were unlikely to mete out such a fate, there were special reasons why he could not consider surrendering to them. To bow the head to Alexander, the man he patronized at Tilsit, was too much for pride to bear, while Napoleon could never forgive Emperor Francis for his treachery in respect of Marie-Louise and his son. He therefore decided to make his home in the USA. He asked for 2 frigates to be put at his disposal and for passports and safe conduct to Rochefort, where he intended to embark for America, routing his request through General Becoeur, commander of the guard at Malmaison, to Fouche via Devout. Fouche authorized the frigates but ordered them not to leave until the safe conducts had arrived. This was an obvious trick to remove the emperor from the Paris area and keep him immobilized at Rochefort while he negotiated to hand him over to the highest allied bidder. Even in his torpid and debilitated state, Napoleon was able to guess Fouche's intentions and checkmated them by refusing to leave for Rochefort until he possessed signed orders to the captains of the 2 frigates there, requiring them to sail for America immediately. At Malmaison, Napoleon put his financial affairs in order, distributing largesse to his family. He gave Joseph 700,000 francs, Lucien 250,000 and Jerome 100,000. He gave Hortense 1,000,000 francs in timber shares and entrusted to the banker Jacques Laffitte his personal fortune of 800,000 francs in cash and 3 million in gold. Then he burnt his papers, still steadfastly continuing to refuse the option of armed insurrection. Benjamin Constant, who 3 months earlier had compared him to Attila and Genghis Khan, notably changed his tune and wrote, "The man who, although still strong in possession of the remains of an army that had been invincible for 20 years, and a name which electrified the multitude, set aside power rather than dispute it by means of the massacre of civil war, has on this occasion deserved well of mankind." On the 27th of June Fouche stopped stalling and decided to let the emperor go on his own terms. Perhaps he wanted him out of the way while the motion to restore the Bourbons was put to the chamber, or perhaps he feared the Allies might seize him anyway. But no sooner had Fouche taken this decision than he learned from his envoys that the Allies were making the settlement of Napoleon a precondition of peace. He now had to force the emperor out of Malmaison without giving him a safe conduct. He therefore informed him that if he remained there he would be put under house arrest. Again Napoleon checkmated him by saying that he refused to travel to Rochefort without safe conducts, and was prepared to take his chances at Malmaison. As the Prussians began to close in on Malmaison, Fouche saw his bargaining counter in danger of being whisked away from him. Fouche sent the necessary orders, permitting an immediate sailing from Rochefort. Napoleon, salving his pride, offered to lead the French armies defending Paris as a mere general. Unsurprisingly, Fouche indignantly turned him down. Then it was time for final farewells at Malmaison. The emperor said goodbye to Madame Mir, then spent his last moments in silent meditation in Josephine's room, before donning the garb in which he was to travel incognito as Becoeur's secretary. The imperial party departed Malmaison on the 29th of June and traveled in 3 coaches, at first via Rambouillet and Chartres, with a diversionary convoy traveling by way of Orleans and Angoulême. From Chartres, Napoleon's coaches proceeded through Vendôme to Tours, and then through Poitiers to Niort. They entered Rochefort on the 3rd of July, with the emperor all the time awaiting a call from Paris to return. He spent the entire journey in an agony of uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing, a few crusts of optimism always sinking into the deeper troughs of pessimistic inertia. At Rochefort he discovered that a British squadron was blockading the port. This development was hardly surprising, as on the 25th of June Foch had alerted Wellington that the emperor intended to sail to the USA. On the very day Napoleon arrived in Rochefort, Paris surrendered to the Allies, and Foch put the final touches to his master plan to restore the Bourbons. On the 3rd of July he, a famous regicide, went with Talleyrand to St. Denis to wait on Louis XVIII. Of this scene, a byword for humbug and hypocrisy, even Chateaubriand, no friend of Bonaparte's, wrote in his Memoirs d'Outre-Tombe. Suddenly the door opened, and silently there entered Vice leaning on the arms of crime, M. Talleyrand supported by Foch. The infernal vision passed slowly in front of me, went into the king's study and disappeared. Foch was coming to swear faith and homage to his lord. The trusty regicide, kneeling, put the hands which had made Louis XVI's head roll in the hands of the martyr king's brother. The apostate bishop stood surety for the oaths. In Rochefort the prefect, following Foch's secret orders, stalled and prevaricated, pleading the impossibility of running the British blockade. In fact, in these early days of July it was perfectly possible for the two frigates, M. Meuse and Saul, to have evaded the blockade. For most of the time only the Bellerophon was on station. But because of Foch's treachery 5 precious days were wasted while the Royal Navy tightened its grip on the port. Nonetheless, Napoleon himself must again be censured for vacillation. He received a good offer from an experienced sea captain for a mass breakout in small ships from the Gironde, using so many vessels that the Royal Navy would not know which one to chase, and then heading for America in the 2 corvettes Bayardier and Indefatigable. Napoleon, foolishly, decided to wait and see. Once again his mental processes remain a mystery. Why did he wait for 5 days in Rochefort, from 3 the 8th of July, when he must have known that speed was essential? Perhaps he thought a safe conduct might still arrive or that a mass demonstration in the army would call on him to return. Joseph was still urging him to link up with the army of the Gironde under Clausel. On the 8th of July Louis XVIII re-entered Paris after an absence of exactly 100 days, having guaranteed the property of those who had benefited from the revolution. Napoleon meanwhile, learning that word had come in from Paris that he must depart at once from Rochefort, set off in a rowing boat for the Lie d'Aix but decided to spend the night aboard the frigate Saul. But a fresh set of orders arrived from the commissioners in Paris. Bonaparte must embark for the USA at once and would not be allowed back on French soil. Anyone abetting him to do so would be guilty of treason. Napoleon was given 24 hours to comply with this order, and the implicit threat was that if he did not do so, he would simply be handed over to the mercies of the incoming Bourbon government. The emperor returned to the Lie d'Aix to ponder his choices. Apart from sailing out to almost certain capture, there only seemed 2 options: either return, put himself at the head of the army and head a revolutionary movement, or surrender to the British and take his chances. Still indecisive, on July he sent his aide Savary and Las Cases to negotiate with Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon and see what terms were available. They bore a letter written by Bertrand, asking if the British would give a safe conduct to the emperor, or whether they were determined to block his passage to the USA. Maitland knew how the wind blew from London but could not resist the opportunity of landing such a prestigious prize. He therefore dissembled and, without committing himself overtly, hinted that asylum in England would be possible. He stalled until he could get instructions from the Admiralty. As expected, these were uncompromising. Maitland therefore suggested that while London took time to come to a final decision, Napoleon's entourage should think carefully about the question of asylum. It was pure Machiavellianism on the part of an ambitious man. Later on the 10th of July Napoleon called a council to discuss what to do. Bertrand, Las Cases, Gourgaud and Savary argued for seeking asylum in England. Montholon and Lallement urged a return to the army. Never a believer in democracy, the emperor went with majority opinion this time as it accorded with his own secret wishes. He reiterated that he would not be the cause of a single cannon shot in France. But what finally clinched matters was when the desperate option of trying to run the blockade was also ruled out. The captain of the Medjus sent a message that he was prepared to engage the Bellerophon in close combat. Naturally the Royal Navy ship would be victorious, but in the meantime the Saul could have cleared for America. Napoleon was initially excited by the proposal, but Philibert, captain of the Saul and senior to Captain Pony on the Medjus, refused to have any part of the plan, fearful of what the Bourbons might do to him afterwards. Angered by Philibert's attitude, Napoleon left the Saul again and landed on the Lie d'Aix. There a new idea was hatched. It was suggested that 6 naval officers should put to sea with Napoleon in a whaleboat, hail the first merchant ship they encountered on the high seas, and charter it to go to the USA. This seemed too far-fetched to the emperor, but he was running out of maritime options, as Baudin, the captain who had offered to take him from a giant port, responded to further overtures by saying he would take the emperor alone and not his court. The dismayed courtiers, fearful of Bourbon revenge, pleaded with Napoleon not to abandon them. He therefore turned down the Baudin idea, as also a last-minute plea from Joseph, who arrived at the Lie d'Aix on the morning of the 13th of July, that he return and put himself at the head of the army. Joseph, in his very last interview with his brother, played a truly fraternal role by urging him to get away to America, and offering to impersonate him until he was safely at sea. At midnight on the 13th of July, Napoleon finally made his decision to seek asylum with the British. Next morning his envoys returned to the Bellerophon. Maitland said he would willingly take Napoleon to England, but could take no responsibility for what happened there. Nevertheless, determined to have the kudos of taking this fabulous prize, he insinuated to the envoys that all would be well. It was only after hearing a highly favorable report from his envoys that the emperor decided to trust his person to the British. Maitland later dishonestly claimed that the envoys had come to him with the formal offer of surrender, without any preconditions. A final council met to approve the emperor's decision. He was supremely ill-advised on this occasion. Gulled by Maitland's honeyed words, his followers also grievously underrated British rancor towards the ogre and imagined they would be bound by the sacred laws of hospitality. From London's vantage point things looked very different. Here was the man who had forced them to rack up the national debt almost to ruinous levels so as to raise Europe in arms against him. Expenditure to the Allies during the 100 Days had rocketed sky-high, with a £5 million flat payment to the Allies, plus a further PSI million to get the Russians to march west and an extra PSC 80 to induce Austria to campaign in Italy. Altogether, Britain disbursed £7 million for what turned out to be a 4-day campaign, a ruinous rate of money for armies exchange. On the 13th of July, Napoleon wrote a famous letter to the Prince Regent, in which he expressed his naive hope that, at worst, he would be subjected to English civil law. Your Royal Highness, exposed to the factions which distract my country and to the enmity of the greatest powers of Europe, I have ended my political career, and I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself on the hospitality of the English people. I put myself under the protection of their laws, which I claim from your Royal Highness as the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my enemies. Napoleon. On the 15th of July the Emperor travelled out to the Bellerophon on the brig Epervier. On the 7-day voyage to England, Maitland treated Napoleon with every courtesy and consideration, never revealing the true attitude of the British government, which he knew to be harsh and unyielding. Both on the Bellerophon and on the flagship Superbe, commanded by Maitland's superior officer Admiral Hotham, the Emperor was treated like royalty. He won the respect and affection of the crew, though his prodigious need for sleep was much commented on. On the 23rd of July he saw the last of the European mainland off Ushant, and remained for 7 hours from dawn until noon on the poop deck observing geographical features with his spyglass. When the Bellerophon anchored at Torbay, boatloads of sightseers came alongside to try to catch a glimpse of the sensation of the hour. Napoleon was encouraged by his reception, but would have been deeply despondent had he known of the fate being prepared for him by a deadly triumvirate of his enemies. The 3 men who decided his future were the Prince Regent, the Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, and Lord Bathurst, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, all men who hated Napoleon for the vast sums he had cost the Exchequer, the fear he had caused them and the knowledge that he had been very close to victory. Liverpool's attitude is very clear in a letter to Castlereagh on the 15th of July. We wish that the King of France would hang or shoot Bonaparte, as the best termination of the business. If the King of France does not feel himself sufficiently strong to treat him as a rebel, we are ready to take upon ourselves the custody of his person. By legal sleight of hand this unsavory British trio declared the Emperor a prisoner of war. Although no state of war existed between France and Britain and Napoleon could not be considered a prisoner anyway, since he had embarked on the Bellerophon freely, Liverpool's tame lawyers were in a quandary, since they could never quite decide whether Napoleon was an enemy alien or an outlaw and pirate, outside the scope of the law of nations. Their problem was that, if he was not an enemy alien, he could not be detained as a prisoner of war. But how could he be an enemy alien if he was not the subject of any ruler? And how could somebody legally be treated as an enemy alien if England was not at war with any other country? If, on the other hand, Napoleon was a pirate, the situation was clear: he must be executed. The middle solution, adopted in a later era at Nuremberg, would have been to put the emperor on trial for war crimes, but such a conception, even with its notorious inability to transcend mere victor's justice, did not yet exist. When the Bellerophon departed from Torbay to Plymouth, Napoleon began to suspect he had a fight for survival on his hands. His one card was public opinion and the legal skill of his British supporters. Everything depended on getting Napoleon onto land by a writ of habeas corpus, and an ingenious stratagem devised to this end. A former judge from the West Indies accused Admiral Cochrane of having failed in his duty by not having attacked Willames's squadron off Tortilla, and demanded that Napoleon Bonaparte appear as a witness. A writ of habeas corpus was obtained, requiring Napoleon's presence in court on November. But while the Bellerophon was anchored off Plymouth, Lord Keith, commander-in-chief of the Channel Fleet, was sent to the Emperor with the British government's answer. On the 31st of July, Keith informed Napoleon that he was to be exiled to St. Helena, where he would be treated, not as an emperor, but as a retired general on half pay. Napoleon protested bitterly against this sentence, pointing out that he had come on board the Bellerophon voluntarily, and that Britain's perfidious action would destroy her reputation in the civilized world. If he was a prisoner, he wanted to know the basis for this in international law, and if Britain assumed legal rights over him, it followed that he was entitled to due legal process. He wrote a formal protest: "I am not the prisoner but the guest of England. If the government, in ordering the captain of the Bellerophon to receive me, as well as my suite, desired only to set a trap, it has forfeited its honor and sullied its flag. As for the insult in addressing him merely as General Bonaparte," he remarked, "they may as well call me Archbishop, for I was head of the church as well as the army." But events were moving away from Napoleon and his supporters. On the 2nd of August, the Allies rubber-stamped the British action in the Convention of Paris. Later, an Act of Indemnity was passed through Parliament, in which the government virtually admitted it had no legal basis for detaining Napoleon on St. Helena. The Admiralty, warned that Bonaparte's supporters were trying to serve a writ of habeas corpus, ordered Maitland to put to sea from Plymouth and cruise off Start Point, where he was to rendezvous with the ship taking the prisoner to St. Helena. Maitland sailed on the 4th of August and after 3 days at sea transferred the Emperor to the Northumberland, under the command of Admiral Cockburn, which was to make the long run to St. Helena. On the 9th of August, the Prometheus of the age began the voyage to the Lonely Rock, where he was to be chained for the rest of his life.